Before there is light, there is water. No shoreline, no sky to hold it back. Just dark, moving depth, stretching in every direction, with nothing above it and nothing below it. And somewhere in that darkness, something is hovering, low, deliberate, over the surface of water that has no name yet, no boundary, no purpose. The text doesn't tell us where this water came from. It doesn't explain why it's already there before anything else exists. It simply says, this was the condition of everything, before God said a single word. And here's what's strange. This water doesn't disappear once the story moves forward. It doesn't get explained, contained, or forgotten. It keeps coming back, under an ark, between two walls at the edge of Egypt, inside the ribs of a fish, underneath a fishing boat on a lake that shouldn't have been able to kill anyone in it. Something about this water refuses to stay in Genesis. And by the end of the story, in the very last pages of the Bible, someone finally says something about it that changes the way everything before it should be read. There is no date for the beginning of this pattern, no king's name to anchor it, no empire to place it under. Whatever else Genesis 1 is doing, it is not trying to give you a moment in history. It's giving you a moment before history, before land has a shape, before light has a source, before there is a single reference point except one, water, and something moving over it. But the people who first heard this account were not hearing it in a vacuum. Scholars widely note that ancient Israel lived in a world where several neighboring cultures told their own stories about beginnings very much like this one. Stories where the world was born out of a struggle, where a god had to fight the sea itself, kill it, and build the ordered world out of its remains. In Mesopotamian tradition, that sea had a name and a face. It came for the gods, and the gods were afraid of it, until one of them wasn't. Genesis tells its story differently. There is no fight recorded, no rival god named. There is water, old, dark, undefined, and there is one voice that simply begins to speak over it. The water doesn't resist, it doesn't attack, it's just there, waiting to be given shape. That's easy to read past, because the ending of the creation week is so calm. 6 days, order after order, land, light, creatures, people, rest. It reads like a completed project. Chaos in, cosmos out, story over. Except the water is never actually gone. It's pushed back, bounded, given edges it didn't have before. But bounded is not the same as removed. And a story that begins with something being held back naturally raises a quiet, almost uncomfortable question underneath its calm surface. What happens if it isn't held back forever? That question doesn't get answered in chapter 1. It gets answered 6 chapters later, and the word the text reaches for, when it needs a term for total catastrophe, is not a new word at all. The world Genesis 6 describes has fallen apart in a way the text doesn't spend much time explaining. It simply says that human violence and corruption have filled the earth, and that God grieves having made it. What God decides to do next is described using language that would have caught an ancient listener off guard. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The Hebrew word behind the great deep is Tehom, the same term used in Genesis 1:2 for the waters that existed before creation, the ones God moved over and pushed back to make room for dry land. Look at what that means. This isn't new water arriving from somewhere else. This is the original chaos, the very waters that were bounded on day 1, breaking back through its boundaries. The text isn't simply describing a natural disaster, it's describing an undoing. The world is returning, deliberately, to the condition it was in before God ever spoke. It's the difference between a dam breaking on its own and a dam being opened on purpose. The flood isn't presented as chaos winning by force. It's presented as God allowing the boundary he set in Genesis 1 to open again, on his terms, for his reasons. And that reframes everything that follows. If the flood is an undoing of creation, then whatever happens when the waters finally recede has to be read as its remaking, which is exactly what the text gives you. When Noah steps off the ark, God's first words to him are almost word for word what he said to the first humans. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Same blessing. Genesis 1, spoken a second time to a second humanity, standing on ground that has just emerged from the deep all over again. But here's the detail worth sitting with. The waters didn't get destroyed in this story. They got used. God didn't eliminate the chaos to save the world. He put a boat on top of it and let it carry new creation through the old one. That pattern, chaos used as a passage rather than simply removed, doesn't stay contained to Genesis. It shows up again, almost immediately, in a story most of us have heard so many times we've stopped noticing its architecture. Centuries later, a nation stands at the edge of a sea, with an army closing in behind them, and nowhere to run. Exodus doesn't waste time on ambiguity here. The water in front of Israel is a real, physical, geographical obstacle, and the army behind them is just as real. But watch the specific language the text chooses for what happens next. And the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Dry ground, in the middle of the sea. That phrase, dry ground appearing where there was only water a moment earlier, is not incidental vocabulary. It's the same basic image from Genesis 1, where dry land first appears out of undivided waters, and from the flood, where the ark finally comes to rest and dry ground reappears after the deep recedes. This is worth slowing down on, because it means Exodus isn't just telling you Israel got rescued. It's telling you, using the oldest vocabulary already present in its own scriptures, that this rescue is being described in the language of a creation event. Israel isn't only escaping Egypt. Israel is walking out of chaos onto ground that didn't exist for them a moment before, the same way dry land didn't exist for anyone at the very beginning of Genesis. It's not incidental that the song Israel sings on the other side of the water, in Exodus 15, immediately turns to describing God in the language of kingship over the waters. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. The earth swallowed them. That is the register a nation reaches for when it senses it has just witnessed the same kind of thing that happened at the beginning of the world. But the pattern doesn't stop with one generation. 40 years later, an entire new generation of Israelites, none of whom crossed the Red Sea themselves, is about to stand in front of a different body of water. And the story that unfolds next is structured so deliberately like the first crossing that it's hard to read it as coincidence. The wilderness generation that left Egypt has died. Their children are the ones standing at the edge of the Jordan River, about to enter the land their parents never reached. Joshua 3 stages this moment with an almost theatrical amount of care. Priests carry the Ark of the Covenant into the river first. The water is described as being cut off in a heap. The Israelites cross on dry ground, and immediately afterward, Joshua sets up 12 stones as a permanent memorial. Specifically, the text says, so that future generations will ask what those stones mean, and be told the story. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you had crossed over, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea. That's the detail. The text doesn't let you miss the connection. It states it outright. This crossing is deliberately built to be a smaller echo of the first one. The same priests in the water structure, the same dry ground language, the same 12-tribe framing. The writer wants the rhyme to be felt, not discovered. Think about what that means for how ancient Israel understood its own story. They weren't taught to think of the Red Sea as a one-time miracle sealed off in the past. They were taught to expect the pattern to repeat, that God's characteristic way of moving his people into something new was to take them, again, through water that shouldn't have parted. It functions the way a chorus works inside a song. You've heard the melody once already, so when it returns, smaller, quieter, in a different key, you recognize it instantly, and it lands differently than it did the first time. The Jordan crossing isn't a new miracle competing with the first one. It's the same miracle, remembered on purpose, so a new generation can step into their own version of it. This pattern isn't only remembered through action either. Centuries later, one of Israel's prophets picks it up and does something bolder with it. reaching for the exact mythic imagery Genesis had quietly avoided, and placing it in the same breath as real, remembered history. By the time the prophet Isaiah is writing, Israel has spent generations surrounded by the same water chaos imagery that shaped its neighbors. Stories where a sea monster represents the forces a god must subdue to bring order into the world. Genesis had mostly avoided that kind of language. Isaiah doesn't. Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over? The verse right before it says something that should stop you. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? 2 sentences, one about slaying a mythic sea dragon, the next about drying up the sea for the Exodus. Isaiah moves between them without a seam, as though they belong to the same category of statement. How literally Isaiah expects his audience to take Rahab as a genuine, mythic chaos monster, versus using it as poetic shorthand for a defeated historical enemy, likely Egypt, is genuinely debated among scholars, and the text itself doesn't settle the question for us. But what isn't really in dispute is the effect of placing the two images side by side. Isaiah is deliberately fusing the cosmic and the historical into a single picture. The same God imagined subduing the primeval sea chaos of legend is the God who, in verifiable, remembered history, dried up an actual sea so an actual people could walk through it. It's the poetic equivalent of laying a myth and a memory on top of each other until the line between them blurs on purpose, and Isaiah does that deliberately. His point isn't really about dragons. His point is that the same power capable of handling the biggest, oldest chaos imaginable is the power that showed up for Israel at a specific sea, on a specific night, inside verifiable history. That's a larger claim than simply, God is strong. It's a claim that everything chaotic, mythic or historical, cosmic or personal, answers to the same hand. Which raises an obvious next question. If that hand is strong enough to subdue the sea completely, why does the sea keep showing up as a threat at all? Why not remove it outright? The book of Job, strangely, gives us God's own answer to that question, and it isn't the answer most readers expect. Job spends most of the book demanding an explanation from God. When God finally answers, out of a whirlwind, he doesn't give Job the explanation he asked for. Instead, he starts describing creation, and one detail he includes is oddly specific. Who shut in the sea with doors, and said, "Thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed." Doors, not walls torn down. Not an enemy annihilated, a boundary, a limit built in on purpose from the beginning. That lines up with something Psalm 74 says in almost the same register. God didn't eliminate the sea monsters, he crushed their heads and set the boundaries of the earth. Over and over, the language of Scripture isn't God removed the chaos, it's God contained the chaos. The sea is never described as gone in the Old Testament, it's described as governed. This is worth pausing on, because it changes the emotional shape of the whole pattern being traced here. If God's characteristic move were to simply erase every chaotic thing the instant it appeared, the recurring water crises, the flood, the Red Sea, the Jordan, would be strange, almost embarrassing repeats of a problem supposedly already solved. But, if the sea was always meant to be bounded rather than abolished, then its repeated reappearance isn't a failure of the first containment. It's the ongoing shape of how this world works, this side of full restoration. Picture a riverbank holding back a current. The riverbank doesn't destroy the river. It gives the river a channel to move through instead of flooding everything in its path. Boundaries do something different than destruction does, and that distinction matters later because it tells you something has been deliberately left unfinished. The sea still has doors, which means, somewhere, a story is still waiting to be told about what happens when someone actually walks through them, for good. That someone, when the pattern finally narrows down to one person, isn't a nation. He's one man, running in the opposite direction from where God told him to go, and he ends up inside the very thing everyone else in this pattern has been crossing through. Jonah is told to go to Nineveh. He goes to the coast instead, books passage on a ship heading the other way, and ends up thrown overboard in a storm he caused. What happens next is described with an economy that almost hides how strange it is. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Here's the detail. Every other water crossing traced so far has been about God's people moving through chaos toward something: freedom, land, a new identity. Jonah's story runs in reverse. He isn't walking through parted water toward a destination. He's descending into it, away from his calling, and the water swallows him rather than parting for him. And yet, he doesn't stay swallowed. From inside the fish, in the middle of that descent, Jonah prays, using imagery that echoes the exact pattern traced so far. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever, yet you brought up my life from the pit. Descent, then deliverance. Undoing, then remaking, even for a man running from God, even inside the belly of the chaos itself. This is a small, personal version of the same architecture. Not a nation walking through a sea on dry ground, but one man being brought back up out of the deep, alive, and given his commission again. Same shape, smaller scale, worse circumstances. Centuries later, someone will point to this exact story as a sign, not of a fish, but of 3 days spent in the deep, before something impossible happens on the other side. But before reaching that connection, the pattern makes one more appearance that most readers walk straight past, because it doesn't look like an Old Testament flood or an Old Testament sea. It looks like an ordinary afternoon on a lake, with 12 frightened men in a boat. Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee, a lake known for storms that arrive fast and violent, funneled down through the surrounding hills without warning. A storm hits, waves are filling the boat. Jesus is asleep. The disciples wake him, and he does something the text describes with almost no drama at all. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Rebuked, that's the word. The kind of word used for silencing an unruly person, not for calming weather. Mark doesn't describe Jesus performing a nature miracle so much as Jesus confronting the sea directly, the way someone confronts a thing with a will of its own. That word choice matters, because it echoes something specific from everything traced so far. The Psalms describe God rebuking the sea and it fleeing. Job describes God alone as the one who shuts the sea behind doors. This is vocabulary reserved, throughout the Hebrew Bible, for exactly one figure, the one who originally hovered over the waters in Genesis 1 and told them where their edges were. So when the disciples turn to each other afterward and ask, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" that isn't a rhetorical flourish. That's 12 Jewish men, who know their own scriptures, watching someone do something only God does in their entire tradition, in real time, on a lake they fish for a living. It's the difference between someone calming a frightened crowd and someone the crowd realizes has never actually been afraid, because the thing frightening everyone answers to him. The disciples aren't only relieved, they're unsettled, because if the sea itself listens to this man, the question of who he is has just become much larger than they were prepared for. That question gets an answer almost immediately, not in a storm, but in a river, at the very site tied to everything traced from the Jordan crossing onward. Before his public ministry begins, Jesus goes to the Jordan River, the same river Israel crossed on dry ground 1,000 years earlier, and asks John to baptize him. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Here's the detail worth stopping on. The location isn't incidental. This is the river an entire nation once crossed on dry ground to receive its identity as God's people. Now one man goes down into that same river, not to cross it on dry ground, but to go under the water and come back up, and receives, in a single sentence, what Israel received across an entire wilderness generation: sonship. This is my beloved Son. Where Israel's identity was declared over a nation crossing through water, Jesus' identity is declared over one man submerged in it. It's the same pattern, compressed and intensified, not walking through the deep, but going into it and rising back out, and hearing, on the other side, exactly what the water crossings were always pointing toward. You are mine. This is who you are now. It's like watching the same photograph developed twice, once as a wide shot of an entire people at a sea, and once as a close-up of a single man at a river. Same moment, essentially, different lens. This is also, worth noting, the exact connection later New Testament writers make explicit themselves, rather than one modern readers are imposing backward onto the text. Paul describes the sea crossing as a kind of baptism into Moses. Peter describes the floodwaters as a type of the water that now saves through baptism. The New Testament authors saw this pattern too, and named it directly. If you're starting to see it now, the same water, the same vocabulary, the same shape, showing up in a flood, a sea, a river, a storm, and a baptism, that's not something most of us were ever taught to notice. Most of us were handed these stories one at a time, with the seams between them smoothed over. Seeing the seams is where this actually starts to open up. If this is the first time you've watched these passages line up like this, it's worth sticking around for where the pattern finally lands, because there's one verse, near the very end of the Bible, that answers the question Genesis 1 verse 2 left hanging from the beginning. If you'd like more of Scripture unpacked this way, subscribing means you won't miss it when we go looking for a pattern like this one again. There's still a loose thread here though. Every water moment traced so far has been about the deep being crossed, contained, or transformed into something that heals. But one question hasn't been answered yet. Does the deep itself ever actually end? Or does it just keep getting managed, generation after generation, indefinitely? That question has one more stop before it reaches its answer, and it comes from a vision most readers associate with architecture, not water. Centuries before any of the gospel accounts, the prophet Ezekiel is shown a vision of a river flowing out from under the threshold of God's temple. What's strange about this river is the direction it moves, not toward the temple, but away from it. And it doesn't behave the way rivers normally do. And I saw many trees on the bank of the river, on the one side and on the other. Everything will live where the river goes. The detail worth noticing is the river's growth. Ezekiel wades into it 4 separate times, and each time it is deeper. Ankle deep, then knee deep, then waist deep, then finally too deep to cross it all. A river that becomes more dangerous to enter the closer you get to its source, and yet everywhere it flows, dead things come alive. Trees bear fruit every month. Even the Dead Sea, the text says, becomes fresh. This is the same water chaos vocabulary followed the entire way through this pattern. Deep water, water you cannot stand in, water with the power to overwhelm, except now it isn't being crossed, contained, or merely survived. It is the very thing healing everything it touches. The exact quality that made the deep dangerous at the beginning of Genesis, its depth, its power, its refusal to be fully controlled, is here the thing bringing everything back to life. Every prior water moment in this pattern has been about getting through the deep to reach something on the other side. Ezekiel's river is different. There is no other side left to reach. The deep itself has become the destination. If this vision is telling the truth about where the pattern is heading, then everything traced so far, the flood, the sea, the river, the storm, the baptism, has been building toward a moment where the very thing that once needed to be crossed, survived, or subdued, simply stops being dangerous at all. Which leaves one last, most important question this account has to answer. Does Scripture ever say, plainly, that this actually happens? There's a detail sitting in Genesis 1 that's easy to read past, because it doesn't look like it's pointing anywhere in particular. Verse 2 says the earth was formless and void, darkness over the face of the deep, and then it says, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Hovering, not striking, not dividing yet, just present, moving, over water that has no order in it at all. Hold that image for a moment. Now go to the very end of the story, Revelation 21. John is shown a vision of the new heaven and the new earth, and the first specific detail he gives us, before the new Jerusalem, before the throne, before anything else, is this: "And the sea was no more." Most readers move past that line quickly, because on the surface it sounds like a simple description of geography, no more oceans in the new creation. But look at where the detail is placed. It isn't one item in a list of new world features. It's the very first thing John mentions, right after new heaven and new earth, as though this is the detail that needed to be settled before anything else could be described. This entire video has been tracing what the sea means every single time it appears. It's never just water. It's the name for the very thing hovering, formless, in Genesis 1:2, before order existed. It's the fountains of the great deep bursting open in the flood. It's the wall of water at the edge of Egypt. It's the river a nation walks through to receive an identity. It's the fish, the storm, the Jordan, the river flowing from the temple threshold. Every single time, across the whole span of Scripture, the deep gets bounded, crossed, survived, transformed, but never once, until this verse, does the text say it is simply gone. Now put those two images side by side. Genesis 1, verse 2, the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, formless, chaotic, unresolved. Revelation 21, verse 1, the sea is no more. The same waters present before the very first word of creation are the same waters finally, explicitly, absent at the very last word of new creation. This is a genuinely debated point among interpreters. Some read the sea was no more primarily as a symbolic statement about the absence of danger, chaos, and death, rather than a literal claim that there will be no bodies of water at all in the new creation. Others read it more literally, but on either reading, the symbolic weight lands in the same place. The thing that has needed to be contained, crossed, or survived since the very first page of Scripture is, by the last page, no longer a threat at all. Not managed, not bounded behind doors, resolved. That is the shape of the whole story, condensed into 2 verses separated by the entire Bible. Genesis opens with God moving over unresolved chaos. Revelation closes with that chaos no longer existing. Everything in between, the flood, the sea, the river, the storm, the baptism, is the long middle of that story, one generation after another, walking through the very thing that will, one day, simply cease to be there, to walk through. The deep didn't return again and again because God kept failing to deal with it. It returned because dealing with it was never meant to be a single, isolated event. It was meant to be a pattern, repeated, deepened, personalized, right up until the moment the pattern is no longer needed, because the thing it was answering has finally been resolved for good. Start over the water again. Dark, wide, no edges, just a spirit, hovering, and a silence about to be broken. Then watch it move. Fountains of the deep, breaking open under a world that has forgotten what it was made for. An ark, riding the very thing meant to end it, carrying a second beginning inside a first ending. A nation, backed against a sea, walking through walls of water on ground that didn't exist a moment before, 40 years later. A river, new feet, the same water, remembering. A man running the wrong direction, swallowed by the very thing he was trying to escape, and somehow, impossibly, brought back up. A boat, a storm, a voice that doesn't ask the water to calm down. It tells it to be still, and it obeys, because it always has. A river again. But this time, only one man goes under. And this time, a voice comes from somewhere else entirely. This is my son. A temple. A trickle at the threshold, deepening with every step, until it's too deep to stand in, and everything it touches comes back to life. And then, at the very end, after all of it, the flood, the sea, the fish, the storm, the river, one sentence, quiet enough to miss. The sea was no more, not tamed again, not bounded behind new doors, gone. The water that hovered before the first word of Scripture is the water that isn't there for the last one. That's not 6 unrelated Bible stories. That's one story, told slowly, told patiently, told across more than 1,000 years and dozens of writers who never met each other, and it still rhymes every single time. There's a reason this pattern doesn't feel distant, even though every part of it happened a very long time ago. Because most of us know what it is to stand in front of something we can't get around. Not an actual sea, not an actual flood, but something that feels exactly as total. A diagnosis, a collapse, a failure we can't undo, a version of our life quietly ending while we're still standing in the middle of it. The specific shape is different every time. The feeling isn't. And most of us also know Jonah's version of this. Not water rising up to meet us, but water we walked into ourselves, running from the one thing we were actually supposed to do. The descent that's self-inflicted is somehow the hardest one to make peace with. It's easier to believe God will meet you in a storm you didn't cause than in one you did. What this pattern seems to insist on, over and over, without ever once promising the water won't come, is that being in the deep was never proof of being abandoned there. Noah wasn't punished by the flood he survived. Israel wasn't left at the sea. Jonah wasn't finished at the bottom of it. Even the disciples, soaked and terrified in a boat that felt like it was ending, were not alone in it, even though it took them until the water went still to realize who else had been in the boat the entire time. That's a strange kind of comfort, because it isn't the comfort of avoidance. Nothing in this pattern suggests the deep water gets skipped. It gets entered. It gets survived. Eventually, in one vision of a river, it even gets turned into the thing that heals. And in one final line, it gets ended altogether, not by anyone managing to escape it, but by someone finally closing the door on it for good. If there's a place in your own life that feels like standing at the edge of water you didn't choose and can't get around, this pattern doesn't explain why it's there. It never really explains that for Noah or Israel or Jonah either. What it shows you, patiently, book after book, is what tends to be true on the other side of it. Dry ground, appearing exactly where you didn't expect to find any. The water was never the end of the story. It was just where the next one always began. If this is the first time you've seen these passages standing next to each other, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Pulling back far enough to see the whole shape of Scripture, not just the pieces we already know by heart. If it opened something up for you, consider subscribing to the Scripture Project. And if someone in your life is standing at their own edge of deep water right now, this might be worth sending their way.